Argentina is the 8th largest country on Earth, bigger than India, more than 4 times the size of France, so vast that its southern region alone, Patagonia, would rank as the 26th largest country in the world if it stood on its own, roughly the size of Egypt. Underneath all that land sit some of the most productive farmland on the planet, plus massive shale gas reserves in the Vaca Muerta formation and lithium deposits large enough to matter to every electric car built this decade. You'd assume a country this rich would be, well, rich. Argentina was. In the early 1900s, it ranked among the 10 wealthiest nations on Earth by income per person, ahead of France, ahead of Italy, pulling in immigrants from across Europe who came looking for exactly the kind of opportunity people now associate with the United States. Buenos Aires built opera houses and boulevards to rival Paris, because for a while, Argentina genuinely was the Paris of the South. And yet, since declaring independence in 1816, this country has defaulted on its sovereign debt 9 separate times, most recently in 2020. Not 9 chaotic accidents scattered across 2 centuries of bad luck. 9 collapses, arriving in a pattern so regular that economists have a specific term for a country like this, a serial defaulter. By the end of this video, you'll understand the one mechanism, buried in the way Argentina's government relates to its own currency, that makes a 10th default nearly built into the system, and why the country that once rivaled Paris now argues, constantly, about whether its own money is worth trusting. Argentina's farmland, the Pampas, covers a fertile plain roughly the size of France and Germany combined. It's some of the best soil on the planet for growing soybeans, corn, and wheat, and for raising cattle on grass instead of feedlots, which is part of why Argentine beef has the reputation it does. Today, Argentina is the world's largest exporter of processed soybean products, soy meal and soy oil, controlling something close to 40% of the global market in both, more than triple the volume of its nearest competitor. Here's the detail worth remembering: this abundance has never been the problem. Argentina has never once run out of things to sell the world. Not lithium, not beef, not soy, not gas. Hold on to that, because everything that happens in the rest of this story happens despite that abundance, not because it was ever missing. So how does a country holding this much wealth in its own soil end up borrowing money it can't repay, over and over, for 2 centuries? The obvious answers, bad luck, corrupt leaders, global recessions, are each true in fragments. Every country has corrupt leaders at some point. Every country gets hit by global recessions. But none of that explains the rhythm of it. Recessions hit dozens of countries every decade, and most of them absorb the hit without collapsing their entire financial system. Only a handful of countries turn recessions into sovereign defaults on a near-generational schedule, and Argentina is the textbook case, the one economists point to when they need a single word for the pattern. For decades, the standard explanation was simple: Argentina overspends, borrows to cover the gap, and eventually creditors say no more. Fix the spending, the theory goes, and you fix Argentina. This was the exact logic behind Argentina's most celebrated reform of the 1990s, pegging the peso 1-to-1 with the US dollar under a law called convertibility, a policy meant to force fiscal discipline by removing the government's ability to print its way out of trouble. For a few years, it worked, spectacularly. Inflation, which had once run into the thousands of % annually and forced Argentines to spend their paychecks within hours before prices moved again, collapsed to nearly nothing. Argentina was held up internationally as a model of market reform, a case study taught in economics departments as proof that the right policy could tame even the wildest inflation. But the very mechanism built to fix Argentina's credibility problem became the trigger for its worst collapse. By locking the peso to the dollar, Argentina surrendered its ability to devalue its way through a downturn, the escape valve every other country still had. When neighboring economies wobbled in the late 1990s, the fallout from Russia's and Brazil's currency crises eroded Argentina's export competitiveness and triggered a wave of capital flight, and Argentina, with its hands tied by its own currency peg, had no lever left to pull. The very policy that had made Argentina look credible was now the thing preventing it from responding to a crisis. By late 2001, 4 years into a deepening recession, the math had stopped working. Argentina's GDP had already fallen nearly 16% since the recession began, tax revenue was collapsing along with it, and with capital draining out of the banking system in a full-blown bank run, the government moved to stop it by force. On December 1, 2001, officials froze nearly every bank account in the country, a policy nicknamed El Corralito, the Little Corral, permitting only small weekly cash withdrawals and locking the rest inside banks that were themselves running out of money to give back. For a population that mostly dealt in cash and didn't trust debit cards, this meant, overnight, an entire country lost access to its own money. 19 days later, President Fernando de la Rúa resigned amid riots and looting in Buenos Aires, reportedly leaving the presidential palace by helicopter while the country burned through 5 presidents in less than 2 weeks, a constitutional crisis stacked directly on top of a financial one. On December 26, 2001, Argentina formally defaulted on roughly $93 billion of external debt, at the time, the largest sovereign default ever recorded anywhere in the world. But that's not even the strangest part of this story. Reveal 1. Argentina's public debt didn't shrink after the default, it nearly tripled, exploding from 62% of GDP to a staggering 164% within months, as the peso collapsed and dollar-denominated obligations became crushing once translated back into a currency that was worth a fraction of what it had been a year earlier. Reveal 2, and it gets worse. Unemployment surged toward 25%, and more than half the population fell below the poverty line within a single year, a country that, a century earlier, had rivaled Paris. Somewhere inside that statistic is a middle-class family in Buenos Aires who, in early 2002, watched their life savings, frozen behind the Corralito's walls just weeks earlier, savings they couldn't even access to protect, lose roughly 2/3 of their real value overnight, simply because the peso they were denominated in no longer meant what it had meant a month before. Families who thought they'd done everything right, who'd saved instead of spent, watched 2 decades of saving evaporate inside a government-mandated freeze they had no way to escape. Reveal 3, and this is where it turns almost absurd. Argentina recovered. Despite predictions that it would become a financial pariah locked out of global credit for a generation, unable to trade, unable to grow, the economy was expanding again within 2 years, driven partly by that same soy and beef the country never stopped being able to sell. And the lesson Argentina's political class seems to have absorbed from that recovery wasn't never default again. It was something closer to default is survivable, maybe even useful, a lesson that, whether intended or not, quietly lowered the cost of doing it again. Reveal 4. Starting in 2005, Argentina restructured the defaulted bonds under harsh terms, offering creditors far less than they were owed, and eventually getting 93% of them to accept the new terms by 2010. But the remaining 7%, mostly U.S. hedge funds, dismissively nicknamed vulture funds by the Argentine press, refused the deal entirely and sued in a New York courtroom instead, betting that full legal enforcement would eventually get them paid in full. Reveal 5, the strangest twist of all. In 2014, Argentina defaulted for a 9th time, not because the money wasn't there, but because a federal judge in New York, Thomas Griesa, ruled that a decades-old contract clause called pari passu, buried in the original 1994 bond agreements, meant Argentina legally could not pay the 93% who'd accepted the restructuring without also paying the 7% who hadn't. Argentina had the cash sitting in an account at the Bank of New York Mellon, ready to go out to the bondholders who'd made a deal in good faith. The bank was legally barred by court order from releasing it. Argentina technically defaulted anyway, on a legal technicality, over a debt fight it thought it had already closed 9 years earlier, undone not by economics, but by 2 sentences of contract language a judge on another continent decided to take literally. Zoom out, and this stops being a purely Argentine story. In 2018, the IMF approved a $57 billion loan to Argentina, the largest standby arrangement in the fund's entire history, and remarkably, its 21st program with this one country alone since 1958. It didn't work. Within 2 years the incoming government had already suspended the program and moved to renegotiate the terms instead. By April 2026, Argentina and the IMF had signed yet another deal on top of the old one, a fresh $20 billion program, meaning Argentina remains, by a wide margin, the single largest debtor the IMF has ever had, a distinction no other country holds even close to as often. And because Argentina supplies something close to 40% of the world's soy meal and soy oil, the protein that feeds livestock from Vietnam to the Netherlands, and the cooking oil in kitchens from Southeast Asia to Europe, every one of these crises quietly ripples through global food prices in a way that has nothing to do with weather or harvests, and everything to do with a currency crisis unfolding 6,000 miles from any supermarket shelf. So here's the twist: the cold open promised. Argentina's problem was never its resources. Remember the farmland the size of France and Germany combined, remember the lithium, the shale gas, the soy that made it the world's top exporter of two entire commodities. None of it has ever run out, not once, in 200 years of this story. A country doesn't run 9 sovereign defaults because it's poor. It runs them because something else entirely is broken. The actual mechanism is currency credibility. Almost every one of Argentina's crises traces back to a government trying to borrow or peg its way past a public that has already stopped trusting the peso, fixing the exchange rate in the 1990s, printing money to cover deficits in other decades, promising stability it couldn't structurally deliver, and each fix has eventually manufactured the exact collapse it was built to prevent. Argentina isn't a poor country pretending to be rich. It's a resource-rich country that has never managed to build a currency its own citizens believe in for longer than about 2 decades at a stretch, which means every generation of Argentines inherits the same crisis their parents thought they'd already solved. As of 2026, Argentina is in the middle of its most aggressive attempt yet to break this cycle, not full dollarization, which was floated loudly during the 2023 campaign but never actually implemented, but a brutal fiscal shock under President Javier Milei, eliminating a budget deficit worth roughly 5% of GDP in a single year, one of the sharpest fiscal adjustments any government has attempted in peacetime, and bringing inflation down from 211% in 2023 to around 33% by mid-2026. That is genuinely remarkable progress by Argentina's own historical standards. It's also, by any ordinary country standards, still roughly triple the inflation rate of a country like Turkey, and the cuts behind it have come at a real human cost that the headline numbers don't capture. Whether this finally breaks the 2-century pattern, or simply becomes default number 10's origin story, is still being written in real time, month by month, IMF review by IMF review. Argentina has declared itself finally fixed before. Investors said it in 1991 when the peso was pegged, and again in 2003 when the economy roared back from the ashes of the corralito. The pattern has never yet cared what decade calls itself the exception, or which president signs the plan.